Hey guys, welcome back to the Green Room where we're doing the road through Romans. And this is, I believe, episode 4. And today Gary is going to be working together with me. We're going to take you through some of the most difficult parts. So if you can hang through this, we can get through it all. Now, we're going to go deep into some really provocative verses. And here's what you need to understand. You know, you've heard the phrase, I've got good news and I got bad news. You've heard that phrase. Well, this is kind of Paul's sandwich theory. He's like, he started out last week, we said, I got some great news, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now I got some bad news. And so that's what we're going to look at today. I'm calling this section Humanity on Trial. It's Romans 1:18 through 32. And it can best be seen, these verses, through the lens of a courtroom trial, because it's as though God is saying, I have a bone to pick with you. And so God is saying, these are some things that you need to understand of what got you standing before the judge. Now, Gary, of course, you know I'm a huge Star Trek fan.
Yeah, here we go.
Nanu, nanu.
Nanu, nanu.
I'm definitely a Star Trek fan. And one of my favorite series out of all the Star Trek is the Next Generation. Okay. It's my favorite one. Yep. And the very first episode opens up with this thing called Encounter at Farpoint, yep, where this being that's kind of godlike, he's like infinite being called the Q, puts humanity on trial. And Picard has got to be the defense attorney, you know, to speak the case for humanity, why he shouldn't wipe them out of existence. And I couldn't help but think about, you know, putting humanity on trial. Well, that's kind of what's happening here. And the charge is that mankind has deliberately violated God's laws. Deliberate, intentional violation. So that's the charge. Verse 18 says, now the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and the wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now, this is a word that we don't often talk about, this idea of the wrath of God. In fact, that might even make you uncomfortable to think, you know, God getting ticked off. That might even mess with your understanding of God. But here's what I would tell you. You need to renew and review your understanding of God. Often we point at the loving and the forgiving aspects of God, but loving us in spite of what and forgiving us for what. And so this aspect of the nature and the character of God is very important. Now, also be aware that there's two different words in the Greek language used for wrath or that anger aspect of God. This word that's being used here is the kind of anger that is a justified, controlled anger. We would call that righteous anger. The other word that's used in the Greek represents a word that means out of control. It's anger that is out of control. Well, that's not what's saying. It's saying that the wrath of God is justifiable and in control. So why does God get angry at sin? Well, the same reason a parent becomes angry at a child who is doing something that we know will recklessly harm themselves and others. And that's what sin is all about. And so the wrath of God, the anger of God, is the recognition that a loving parent has had it. It's saying what you're doing is wreaking havoc on it. So the objects of that wrath is the godlessness and the wickedness. Now again, notice those two words. What's the difference between those? Well, godlessness is literally living as though God doesn't exist. That there's, you know, no one to hold me accountable for my actions. And wickedness is living as though there are no rules. Now, these two aspects have to do with the different aspects of sin. It has to do with how my sin affects both God and others. The godlessness and the sin of against others. And so mankind becomes charged then with 3 counts of godlessness and 3 counts of wickedness in this verse. And I want to go through these verses, 19
yeah, but can
through 31.
I just interject something real quick? Because you said something that was really important there. And you said, like, we like to dwell on the lovingness of God and the grace of God, and we don't like to think about the wrath of God. But I would submit that you can't truly understand the depth of God's love for you or the depths of God's grace towards you till you realize the amount of wrath that he feels because of your sin. Because he has to get over that. You know, he has to lay that aside in order to get that. So when you think about God being angry at sin, how does the Bible talk about that? What does that mean? What's going on in the heart of God when he sees us sin? And I see the pictures that come out like 6 to 8 times across the book of Ezekiel, right? Where he's saying Israel is whoring after other gods.
Yeah.
And Israel is whoring, putting on makeup and selling herself, right? And when you and I sin, what we're doing is we're choosing the gratification that we're going to get over that sin over our relationship with God. Just like an unfaithful wife or husband who chooses a prostitute, or worse yet, chooses to become a prostitute for some sort of gratification or money over a right relationship with a husband.
Yeah.
And all throughout Ezekiel, God is saying, I am the wronged husband. the anger and angst that you want to understand how I feel about your sin? You want to understand the wrath I feel towards that? This is the picture of that. And then we go, but wow, in spite of that, he still does this great thing, right, to make us right with him again. And how loving and amazing is that? So it's a big, big deal to understand this concept of the wrath of God. That's why Paul put it in here.
And I think that it's important, those 2 words that I used in the opening, that the charge was deliberate and intentional. In other words, it's someone like a child who says, I don't care what this does to you, and I don't care what it does to anyone else. I'm going to do this not only knowing it's wrong, but also knowing what it's doing to you. That it's breaking your heart, it's destroying our relationship, and it's harming others. But I don't care.
Yep.
And so then Paul goes through these verses to lay out example, the example of the charges. So he's giving off the evidence. Verse 19, since what may be known about God is plain to them, well, because God has made it plain. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. You see, although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. He's talking about idolatry. Verse 24, therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie. They worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. And because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what they ought not to be done. They become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. And they even invent new ways of doing evil. They disobey parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. So Paul is just laying it out. Now, again, it's exemplary. It's showing the example of that, but it's not exhaustive. And so this is not the only. He's showing 3 things that I think are important here. The panorama of sin, the pattern of sin, how one sin leads to the other, and then the progression of sin, how sin continues becoming even further and further more demoralizing, degrading, and detestable to God. So Paul submits these 3 evidences to show that we try to live our lives as though God doesn't exist. And Gary, talk a little bit about, in these verses, how God reveals himself so that we're not without excuse.
Yeah. So just before I get to that, I want to point out, this whole pattern started out with idolatry. And I don't want you guys to miss that, because so often when I was younger, when I would read this, I would go, those guys doing adultery, I'm so glad we don't live in a time when adultery happens anymore, because, I don't have my little brass statue, and, I'm good enough. I'm not checking my horoscope. I believe in God. And so I would never do any of that stuff because I don't pray to an idol, right? But idolatry is so much more than that. And anything that gets more of your attention, anything that gets more of your time, anything that's kind of like, I couldn't live without this, we make idols out of so much stuff. And these idols lead us down the same exact road that's described from then on down.
Yeah.
We just aren't explicit about it. So I don't want you guys, I feel like some of us might check out and say, well, those guys, they're worshiping idols, so obviously they went extreme crazy. We don't worship idols. Well, actually we do. We actually do. We just are more subtle and we've fooled ourselves about it. So I just wanted to point that out. But yeah,
I would say idolatry is when I seek to satisfy something which can only be fulfilled by God Himself. Mm-hmm. It's putting something in the place of a God.
Yep.
So I'm glad you pointed that out.
Yep. So how has God revealed Himself to us? What are these three evidences that says we should have known, right? We should see these things. First thing about it is God has revealed us in an unmistakable way, just absolutely unmistakable. He says this explicitly when he says God has made it plain to them. Paul is just saying, look, this was clear to be seen by everybody, absolutely plain and clear. And we see it reaffirmed in the Old Testament in Psalm 19:1. It says, the heavens proclaim the glory of God, the skies display His craftsmanship. It's like if you can wake up in the morning, take a breath of air, look out and see the expanse of everything that's out there, you have to go, well, I didn't make that, and I don't know anybody else who could have made that. There must be God. It's plain and it's clear. We all should be able to see it. It's unmistakable. And that leads us to the second one, which is it's universal. It's universal. The Apostle Paul says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen. And we continue to see that this look at creation tells us more than there must be God, but it tells us some clear characteristics about who God is. So what are they? Well, one, God is eternal. He's eternal. From the beginning of time to the end of time, the God who's over it, who's making this whole thing move along, He's been there, and this is so much bigger than me, and I can see by how much bigger creation is that He is too. Two, He's powerful. Man, if He can make the Grand Canyon, you know what I mean? If He can make an ocean that's that big, if He can make a creature that could just totally squash me, how powerful is God? And so it tells us, man, if the God who made it, it's got to be more powerful than the thing that's made. He's this all-powerful God. It's a God who's logical. So how do we think about God as logical? Well, we have science now, and we've learned about the rain cycle and how things fit together. And we've learned about how cells work, and we look at our body and our different systems of our body and how those things work together. There is definitely a sense of logic behind the way creation is knit and put together and the way it works. And so we have this eternal, powerful, logical God that we just see from creation that's before us. So it shows us this universal idea. And then the other one is that Paul submits that this is just undeniable, the fact that God exists. It says He showed us all these things so that people are without excuse. So Paul is saying, here's the deal, y'all. You don't have an excuse. You can't miss this. You're not trying hard enough if you miss this. It's on you. And the word we see here is anapologetos. And we talked about apologetics last time, this idea of being able to logically make an argument to defend who Christ is. Well, here he's saying it's the opposite of that. There is no arguable defense to say there is no God if you just look at creation, if you just look at the logic behind things. That's what Paul's argument is there, and it's a pretty good argument.
So it's funny because I think that someone who is an atheist says, look, I don't have to live under all your junk and all your moral rules and all that kind of stuff. I don't even believe there is a God. And I think it's interesting that Paul's saying, I don't care.
Yeah, he says, I don't care. Yeah.
He's saying, because the reality is, God has left a witness unto Himself. Mm-hmm. So it is undeniable and indefensible, and you do have to face this God that you have violated. So how have we responded? And Paul gives us three ways that mankind has responded to the revelation that God has left for Himself. First, in verse 18, he says, mankind has repressed the truth about God. He says people repress the truth. Now, what does that mean? It means I live in contradiction to what I know is an absolute fact. You know, the issue, and let me just let me step in some sensitive territory. We like to debate the issues surrounding homosexuality and identity and all of these things. We debate this in our current culture. And we talk about, and I've even talked with Christians who would say, well, I believe everything about the Bible, but I do believe it's okay to be gay and to be a Christ follower. And what I would say is, well, what does God have to think about the subject? Because at the end of the day, it's God who ultimately sets the rules. Not how I feel about it. It's not what I think about it. It's what God says about it. And the reality is here, it's very clear. He uses that as one of many different ways that we could illustrate the rejection of God's truth. But it says we suppress it and we just say, hey, I'm going to live by my moral code, not your moral code.
Our community, our culture, our way of life would be so much better and so much easier if we would all just say, hey, it doesn't matter so much what I think about it. What matters more is what God thinks about it. At the end of the day, He's the one who made this stuff, and He's the one who made us. He knows what we need, and we're so determined to think that I'm the important one, and my opinion is what's matter, and actually my friends and collectively is what's matter. And when we move down that road, we just cause confusion across everything, between everything. If we could just stop and say, wait a minute, in whatever this issue is we're talking about, what's God's point of view about that? It would bring a level of clarity of thinking that helps you get to this place of peace and clearness, and you can actually know truth. And that would be good across whatever topic you're talking about. It's a big, big deal.
Yeah, life tends to work when we do it God's way.
That's right.
And there's a lot of ways that we can do life. You can do it the hard way or the easy way. Which way would you like? Yeah. And so God has actually said, look, I created the entire universe not to be restrictive or to be, prohibitive or to say, oh, follow the rules or I'll kill you. It really was actually all designed for the Garden of Eden, everything in all of creation designed for our enjoyment, our pleasure, and His glory. Yep. And when we follow God's pattern of rules, it brings all of those. Yep. And so it says we repress the truth. Man, I don't want to hear that stuff. Nope. We reject the truth. It says, although they knew God, they neither glorified Him nor gave thanks to Him. It's interesting. He says that the creation and the heavens testify. And I think it's funny. I'm old enough now and have lived long enough to watch how evolution has moved from fact to fact. It's just a fact. And they teach it in high school, and it's just a fact, you crazy person. And now scientists, not Christians, scientists are going, hey, evolution, that doesn't work. It was great in the 19th century when we didn't have as much technology and understanding. But as far as the purity, and I know already some of you that have sold out to evolution have already tuned out, so that's cool. But those that haven't yet, hang with me. The ones that are intellectually honest, the scientists that are intellectual, say, that doesn't work. The universe clearly demonstrates a maker. Now, you don't have to confess that maker is the God of the Bible, but the evidence left behind in the universe says, hey, somebody designed this thing with incredible intelligence. Yeah. So they reject it. We go, I'll just make up some other theory and then I don't have to deal with God.
I want to point something out with this that I think is really cool. And I just noticed this just now. The act of rejection described here is not, I evaluated the facts, I found them to be unsatisfactory, and now I'm going to tell you I reject that. The rejection here is, I didn't glorify Him and I didn't show gratitude to Him. Yeah. And how many times in our life do we do things and something awesome happens and we aren't grateful? And how many times does something cool happen or something coming together and you're like, but I didn't give God any glory for that. And wow, by my lack of glorification or my lack of gratitude, am I in some way rejecting that I didn't even realize I might be doing?
Yeah, because if I acknowledge that God is truly the author, then I owe him my gratitude and honor. And then third, verse 22, he replaces the truth. Although they claim to be wise, they became fools. Why? They exchanged. That's a critical word there. They exchanged the glory of God. In other words, they said, we got to fit something in its place. And that brings us all the way back full circle to idolatry. That idolatry can either be the crude idolatry, where it's literally an idol, that's sitting on a shelf, or the cultured idolatry. And C.S. Lewis wrote quite a bit about this idea that your soul was created for worship, and whether you like it or not, you're going to worship something. That object that you worship, if not God, is idolatry. If it's sex, if it's drugs, if it's career, if it's your kids. No matter how you slice and dice it, if you give to that thing which is due only to God, that is idolatry. And Paul says the result of these two, godlessness is the root and wickedness is the fruit. So what does God do? And I want to end with this. God does this. It says 3 times in verse 24, verse 26, and verse 28. Therefore, God gave them over. Now, for some of you, you may have responded to that a little bit emotionally. I don't get that, Pastor Brian. Why would God just give up? Listen and read my lips. He didn't give up. He gave over. So you say, well, what's the difference? Well, let's go to the story of the prodigal son. Jesus is telling a story to demonstrate the heart of the Father. And in that story, he says that the son, who is a prodigal in total rebellion, demands his rights. And the Father doesn't reject, he doesn't deny, he actually gave him over. He literally gave him that inheritance, and he allowed that son to suffer the consequences of his own decisions. What the Bible means when God gives us over, it means he removes the umbrella of protection over our life and allows the natural consequences of our choices. And that's what it says in Scripture. Paul is saying God just allows the full unfolding of what we deserve. And so what's the verdict in all this? Verse 32. They know God's justice requires that those who do these things deserve to die, but they do them anyway. And even worse, they encourage others to do them also. In other words, misery loves company. And so the end all is that Paul lays out this courtroom case and he says, this is God's right response. The charge, we have willfully, intentionally, deliberately rejected and replaced and repressed the truth of God, and we've decided to be a God unto ourselves, and we've engaged in violations that clearly harm God, breaking his heart, violating his law, and harm others. And the result of that is death. And that's where it started in the garden.
Yeah, and a good thing to point out, and I'm glad you used the term we. Who is the we we're talking about here? All of mankind. Every last one of us. In the inclusion of this argument, there's not anybody, but yeah, I'm one of the good ones, so I'm not me. He doesn't make an allowance for that. The whole time.
It's humanity.
This is all of humanity who he's talking about. And you said at the beginning, we're putting all of humanity on trial. I just wanted to emphasize that one more time, because when we get down there, we're looking for the out, right? We're looking for the out. We're saying, yeah, but I don't want to be the one. But it's us.
It's all of us. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today in just these few verses, and here's what I want to challenge you to do in your group. I bet you we've uncovered a few little sensitive spots where you go, hey, wait a minute. Or if you were in the courtroom, you would cry, objection. And so here's what I want you to do in your group as you unfold and unpack and discuss these. Talk about where would you rise up in the courtroom and say, wait a minute, Your Honor, I object. And I hope you have a great discussion. We'll see you next time.